Hello everybody. Now today I would like to have a look at the role of Mitch within A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. Now it's fair to say that Mitch exists on the periphery of the trio of Blanche, Stella and Stanley, but nonetheless he still plays an important and significant role within the play. On one hand, he offers a counter, a contrast to Stanley's sexual dynamism and his masculine brute force. And on the other hand, the prospect of his relationship with Blanche offers her a dim hope at future salvation and security, a hope that we know as the audience is ultimately dashed by the end of the play, and this adds a whole nother layer of poignancy to Blanche's tragic story. Now, we're going to roll through a few key scenes in which Mitch features, and as I've alluded to already, we're going to think about his wider role and function within the play as a whole. So where to start? Who is Mitch and what is his role? Well, he's Stanley's self-proclaimed best friend. They served with each other in the army. They were in the same section, the 241st Engineers. Yet, strangely, he's largely treated with contempt and largely seen as a source of ridicule among Stanley and his friends. He's labelled as boneheaded and a crybaby, for example, for doting on his sick mother. And as a result, many people often view Mitch as merely a comic foil to Stanley. He appears childish and somewhat of a mummy's boy to his friends. He's openly embarrassed about his bodily functions, such as the way he perspires. And ultimately, he lacks the experience to see through Blanche's affected demureness. Now, what I mean by that is that he lacks the insight and the nous to see through this facade that Blanche creates for herself. The facade of the lily-white, pure southern belle. And he is unable to see through her willful self-dramatisation, the image that she wants to portray of herself. And by the end of the play, he ultimately then lacks the wisdom and the insight to recognise Blanche's worth and her value. Once his first illusions have been shattered by Stanley, he then shuns Blanche to the outside. And, as I've said already, perhaps his most important function within the plot of Streetcar is that he offers the possibility, the hope, however pallid, however dim, of future happiness and security for Blanche. And the kind of dashing of that hope by the end of the play, in true Tennessee Williams fashion, makes her ultimate catastrophe all the more poignant. Now, in the York Notes, Hannah Sambrook describes Mitch as shy, clumsy, slow-thinking, and he acts as a foil to the shrewd, loud, domineering Stanley. He is also very different from the poetry-loving, fanciful Blanche with her cultural aspirations. His role is to offer Blanche the promise of a safe haven, a cleft in the rock to hide in, as she says. And I've put this in bold because this is an important point here. The prospect of this relationship then spurs Stanley indirectly to find out about Blanche's past in order to protect his old buddy. Now, this part in bold is particularly significant because it's not only does he have the prospect of a relationship with Blanche, but this relationship almost acts as a catalyst for Stanley to uncover Blanche's sordid past. So where do we first see Mitch? We first see him in scene 3, the poker night, an ensemble scene in which all the major characters really are on stage. Now, despite Stella proclaiming that Stanley is the only one from his crowd that's likely to get anywhere, when Blanche immediately notices Mitch, she describes him as superior to the others and says that he has a sensitive look. And they go through a somewhat awkward exchange of dialogue that ultimately leads to Mitch assisting Blanche in putting up the paper lantern. If you think about what's symbolic here, this is symbolic of Blanche's constructed reality, the image, the soft glowing image of the Southern Belle that she wants to get across to Mitch. So it's really quite significant that he at first assists her in putting up this paper lantern. An object that he later then tears down when her secrets are revealed in scene 9. He shows Blanche his cigarette case with an inscription of Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and reveals that it was a gift from a previous romance. So immediately the audience there make this link that they have both shared the loss of a loved one, and they bond ultimately within the play through this loss. And as we can see here, in some of the very awkward exchanges between the two, look at Mitch here with an awkward curtsy. How do you do, Mr. Bois? And the bit where they are dancing to the sounds of the radio before it gets lobbed out of the window by Stanley. He's described as moving in awkward imitation like a dancing bear. Now, what we can see through these stage directions and bits of dialogue here is that Mitch's movements and mannerisms and actions are characterized by awkwardness. The word awkward or awkwardly only appears 6 times in the text as a whole, and they are all linked to Mitch in some way. Here, when the violence eventually erupts in the poker scene, Mitch doesn't blame Stanley for the violence. He doesn't blame the kind of casual acceptance of violence towards women that we see within the play. Mitch blames poker, okay, and repeats, I think at least twice, that poker should not be played in a house with women. This is a very weak response, isn't it? It also sets up poker as an explicitly masculine pursuit, which we do see throughout the play. And when Blanche is obviously very riled by what she's just seen, she says, "I'm terrified." And he kind of says, no, it's nothing. There's nothing to be scared of. They're crazy about each other. I'm not used to such. And he admits that it's a shame, but don't take it serious. So this is Blanche being introduced very much to the raffish charm and blunt realism of life in Elysian Fields. But ultimately, this scene ends with them having a cigarette and Blanche saying, "Thank you for being so kind. I need kindness now." So immediately after the blustering and domineering attitude of Stanley, Mitch does provide a bit more sensitivity and, like I said, a counter to this masculine force within the play. We then see Mitch in scene 6, and both he and Blanche return after somewhat of a failed date, really, and they arrive back at the apartment. Mitch quite haphazardly attempts to converse with Blanche, but rather than the usual topics of conversation when dating someone, the topics that Mitch turns to are the way that his alpaca coat, his lightweight alpaca coat, the way that he is ashamed of the way he perspires, and he also then goes on to talk about both his and Blanche's body weight. So we really get a glimpse here into how poorly managed and how inexperienced Mitch is within this kind of with women in general, and how haphazardly and clumsily he manages this conversation with Blanche. We see in this scene Blanche's willful, as I've used this phrase before, her willful self-dramatization and role-playing in full effect. This is what I meant at the start by Mitch lacking that insight to see through this. If you remember in this scene, she bamboozles him with French. She even says, "Voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir?" which means, "Will you go to bed with me?" She uses a very formal register throughout, and this highlights her contrast and the contrast of education and background between her and Mitch. This kind of a really easy example to remember of this is when she says, "Unhand me, sir," and she later says that he's behaving utterly uncavalier. So she uses this very formal register throughout, and it's heightened when she's speaking with Mitch to really emphasise this contrast between the two. Blanche begins to weave, as she does already at the start of the play, a web of illusions here about herself. And according to Judith Thompson, this web of illusions elevates her debased nature, obviously we know about her promiscuous and sordid past, to the mythicized stature of the lily-white southern belle with old-fashioned ideals. So this is really a scene in which we see Blanche role play to full effect and role play this figure of the Southern belle with her old-fashioned ideals. Again, if we look at moments in the texts, notice again from this scene how Mitch's actions and mannerisms are characterized by awkwardness. She leans on the porch rail, he opens the door and stands awkwardly behind her. Mitch gets up awkwardly. He fumblingly embraces her. Now, this is something we will then see later on, but this clumsiness and awkwardness really underpins a lot of Mitch's mannerisms and actions. So within this scene, we also see how Mitch and Blanche are drawn together by their mutual need for companionship and support. They therefore, at this moment in the play, believe themselves to be quite right for one another. They also discover that they've both experienced the death of a loved one, and as I've mentioned already, that they are almost bond through this sense of loss. And this scene ends really with Blanche's on a moment of hope for Blanche, on a moment of hope for redemption for Blanche, and it ends with those words, "Could it be you and me, Blanche?" So after what was a somewhat failed date, this scene in scene 6 ends with a pallid sense of hope for Blanche and the real prospect of a relationship between the two. But this is a Tennessee Williams play, and we know things never really work out like that. In the ensuing scenes, Blanche's secrets are ultimately revealed. Remember, Stanley inquires amongst his many acquaintances about Blanche's past at the Pink Flamingo, etc. And although Stanley seems to treat Mitch with a almost tolerant superiority, he's obviously very tolerant of him, but he's also always keen to know that he's more superior and more forceful than he is. He does show what would seem a quite strong sense of loyalty to him. And really, throughout these kind of interlude scenes, we get a really clear insight into Stanley's code of morality and conduct. It's ruthlessly clear-cut and simple, like a lot of things in Elysian Fields. He wants to defend his territory, his turf, from this outsider figure of Blanche, and he wants to defend his wife, his home, his friends against this invasion or imposition. If you look at this dialogue here between Stanley and Stella, he says, "Mitch is a buddy of mine. We're in the same outfit together, the 241st Engineers. We work in the same plant and now on the same bowling team. You think I could face him if..." "Stanley Kowalski, did you repeat what that..." "You're goddamn right," I told him. "I'd have had that on my conscience for the rest of my life if I knew all that stuff and let my best friend get caught." So this is where he tells, we can presume off stage, he has told Mitch about the secrets that he's revealed and exposed about Blanche. And as I mentioned already, the relationship, or the prospect of a relationship between Blanche and Mitch, is really important because it acts as a catalyst for Stanley to uncover her sordid past, as we see here. So this leads to a very, very failed birthday meal. And after Blanche's calamitous birthday meal, Mitch appears now wised up by Stanley about Blanche's promiscuous past. We also see here quite cleverly the Varsuviana polka music. If we think about elements of the plastic theatre, these non-naturalistic elements, and in foreboding anticipation of disaster closing in on her, the rapid feverish polka tune of the Varsuviana rises up in Blanche's memory. Now, Mitch's arrival in what Blanche described as uncouth apparel. So if you think here about this formal register that Blanche uses around, most of the time, but more significantly around Mitch, we see this here. He clocks up in blue denim work clothes and an unshaven face, and this really signifies now that as Blanche's secrets have been revealed to him, that Mitch no longer represents the image of romance, but rather the utterly uncavalier intrusion of harsh, unvarnished reality that Blanche is soon to be encountered with. And despite the poker stopping on Mitch's arrival, a sign of her hope and redemption, it soon increases intensity, as do Blanche's fears and anxieties and guilt, until she hears the shot. Now, what's also interesting within this scene is how Williams uses non-naturalistic elements, that being the Varsuviana poker, and how he uses his concept of the plastic theatre to full effect. Now, I'm not going to explain about this concept in any detail, because if you've studied this play, you really should know about the plastic theatre and how it's employed throughout. Now, this extract is taken from the Hodder Guide, the revision guide for A Streetcar Named Desire. And if you look here, it says, with the arrival of Mitch, the poker tune stops, as I've said already. But as she realises the depth of his anger, Blanche begins to voice her experience of the Varsuviana aloud. In theatrical terms, Williams' signature sound effect has now become something that his characters discuss openly, in another remarkable instance of his experimental dramatic approach. So before, the poker tune is what we would call a non-diegetic sound. So it's not arisen from the scene. It's a tune. It's a noise that's purely in Blanche's mind. And this, in scene 9, is the first time she vocalizes it. It's the first time it becomes apparent to other characters on the stage. She says, you've stopped that poker tune that I had caught in my head. Have you ever had anything caught in your head? Yada, yada, yada. As Mitch continues to show his anger and bitterness, Blanche resorts to her usual modus operandi of play acting and pretense. So she continues to put on this facade, and despite the way he looks, in his blue denim work clothes and his unshaven face, she pretends that business is as usual. And she talks again in these quite metaphorical terms. Something's the matter tonight, but never mind. I won't cross-examine the witness. I'll just... And then the poker starts again. The poker tune starts again. Pretend I don't notice anything different about you. That music again. What music? The Varsuviana. The poker tune they were playing when Alan... Wait. Then we hear the shot. There now, the shot. It always stops after that. Yes, now it's stopped. Are you boxed out of your mind? So this is really the first time that the Varsuviana is externalized and becomes something that is openly discussed. This non-diegetic sound that's originally just originating in Blanche's mind. It's a symbol of her psychological turmoil. It becomes open and out there. It almost breaks through that wall. So this is really significant scene when examining how Williams uses elements of the plastic theatre. And it's there to accentuate Blanche's mental downfall and the kind of increased anxiety and turmoil that she's in. Later in the scene, at the appearance of the Mexican woman selling flowers of the dead, the poker tune fades in. The eerie and haunting cry of Flores para los muertos triggers a sequence of terrible memories for Blanche, who tells Mitch of the family illnesses and deaths that she tried to compensate for by an ultimately ruinous series of promiscuous encounters with young soldiers at the local army camp. Now, this is where we finally get a degree of truth out of Blanche within this scene, but unfortunately, it's too late for her. And as she says this confession, there's these eerie cries of flowers for the dead from the Mexican flower seller, and it really is a scene in which Blanche's secrets and truths are revealed. The harsh light of reality is shone upon her. And we see this through this dialogue here. Now, I mentioned in scene 3 that it's significant that Mitch is the person who assists Blanche in putting up the paper lantern. But now he tears the paper lantern off and she utters a frightened gasp, almost as if the lantern is herself being kind of exposed and violated, so to speak. And look at Blanche. What did you do that for? So I can take a look at you good and plain. Now, he previously says, I've never seen you really in daylight, and Even if I do, it's always some place that's not lighted much. Now, previously, Blanche openly admits to Stella that she wants to deceive Mitch enough to make him want me. But here we see that facade, we see that constructed reality violently torn away. Of course, you don't mean to be insulting. No, just realistic. And then these famous words from Blanche: I don't want realism, I want magic. Now, this is really a scene that has much wider metaphorical implications. Many would argue that it's really the kind of realism and literalism of the harsh world of Elysian Fields finally catching up with Blanche. It's perhaps the lies of her past finally catching up with Blanche. And within this scene, he actually admits that he doesn't really mind her being that much older, but he can't deal with her lies and he can't deal with her past. And this is shown here. I don't mind you being older than what I thought, but all the rest of it, Christ, that pitch about your ideals about being so old-fashioned and all that malarkey that you've dished out all summer. Oh, I knew you weren't 16 anymore, but I was fool enough to believe you were straight. And notice again how he fumbles to embrace her. What does he want? What I've been missing all summer. Then marry me, Mitch. I don't think I want to marry you anymore. No, you're not clean enough to bring in the house with my mother. Now, even here, okay, even when Mitch finally attempts to exert some masculine force and have his way with Blanche, he's described as fumbling. And he's ultimately left to clatter awkwardly down the stairs in his hurried exit, almost quite ridiculous exit when she starts screaming, fire, fire. Now, this is the same fumble that we saw earlier in scene 6. So even when he does try to kind of exert, like I said, this masculine force, he's described as fumbling and incapable. His attempt to take sexual advantage of Blanche ultimately is a fiasco. Even the words of his rejection are weak. He doesn't think he wants to marry her anymore. And Mitch, in this line that he says, I don't think you're clean enough to bring in a house with my mother, he expresses both his feelings of respect and love for his sick mother in these lines, and also a condemnation of Blanche when he describes her as not being clean enough to bring home. Now, funnily enough, Mitch appears quite unconcerned by the fact that Blanche is older than him, and he doesn't really seem that concerned by the fact that she was married. But he cannot accept her promiscuous past at the Pink Flamingo in Laurel. And this shows, as with other characters within the play, he shares this sort of traditional male attitude towards women's sexuality. He wants her to be as innocent as she pretends to be. He wants this facade of the Southern belle to be real. Now, I also wanted to alert you to Judith J. Thompson's reading of Mitch within her book Myth, Memory and Symbol. Now, within this, Thompson draws some quite clear parallels between Mitch and Alan, and there's ripe scope for. Now, I also wanted to alert you to Judith J. Thompson's reading of Mitch within her book Myth, Memory and Symbol. Now, within this book, she draws clear parallels between Mitch and Alan Gray, Blanche's former husband. And she argues that within scene 9, Mitch reenacts the retributive punishment of cruel exposure and fatal rejection to which Blanche had subjected Alan. Now, this is expanded on here in this extract. Just as Blanche had exposed Alan Gray's true sexual nature, so Mitch exposes the total ruin beneath Blanche's idealised persona. Tearing the rose-coloured Chinese lantern from the naked light bulb so I can take a look at you good and plain, Mitch not only strips Blanche of her romantic pretensions of youth, refinement and virginal innocence, but also symbolically divests her of all her illusions, hopes and dreams of magically transcending the corrupt past. Now, what this means is that through tearing away the paper lantern, Mitch not only tears away this image of the Southern belle with her kind of virginal purity, he also tears away any hope that Blanche has of overcoming her sordid and debased past. He tears away any hope that she has for future salvation and security. Just as Blanche was deluded about Alan, so Mitch feels like a fool to believe he was straight. His disdainful rejection of her, "You're not clean enough to bring in the house with my mother," parallels precisely Blanche's own contemptuous rejection of Alan. "You disgust me." So some real interesting parallels here, and an interesting reading of this scene as a reenactment, a mirroring of Mitch's rejection of Blanche acting as a mirror of Blanche's rejection of Alan. And if we think about this, they are both shunned, they are both excluded as non-conformist outsiders within this scene, and the same for Blanche when she rejects Alan and says that "you disgust me." So, moving on to scene 10, which is the kind of climactic scene. We're not going to focus on Stanley's actions as much, but more about what Blanche says about Mitch here. When she gives out her kind of famous speech about casting her pearls among swine, she says that she continues these lies and says that Mitch repeated slander to me and vicious stories that he had gotten from you, and I gave him his walking papers. But then he came back. He returned with a box of roses to beg my forgiveness. He implored my forgiveness. But some things are not forgivable. Deliberate cruelty is not forgivable. It is the one unforgivable thing, in my opinion, and it's one thing of which I have never been guilty. And so I told him, I said, "Thank you, but it was foolish of me to think that we could ever adapt ourselves to each other. Our ways of life are too different." The Dubois and the Kowalskis have different notions, as Stanley would say. Our attitudes and our backgrounds are incompatible. We have to be realistic about such things. So farewell, my friend, and let there be no hard feelings. So it's, again, Blanche is continuing these lies. We know that he didn't return with a box of roses Mitch didn't return with a box of roses to beg for forgiveness. And it's very ironic that she's telling Stanley that we have to be realistic about such things, when literally one scene earlier she says those quite famous lines, "I don't want realism, I want magic." So these lines are peppered with irony here. We do have to probably agree with Blanche that, yes, they could probably never really adapt to one another, and that their attitudes and their backgrounds are incompatible. But ultimately, this is really Blanche's last very hollow defence, just before the sort of climax, the grim climax of the play. Now, it's also ironic that Blanche claims that she's not guilty of deliberate cruelty, when really we know about her quite deliberate and cruel actions towards Alan, something that she's still haunted with throughout the play. And we have to question, is Mitch guilty of deliberate cruelty in the rejection of Blanche, either in its meaning or its manner? Or, like Blanche, when feeling betrayed by Alan Gray, is he simply unable to cope with this new reality? So he hits out like a child and runs away and fumbles and clumsily messes everything up. Now, as I've mentioned before, Williams has in the past stated that this play is really a play about misunderstanding. And we see this not only through the interactions between Blanche and Stanley, but I think even more so between the actions of Blanche and Mitch. And the last time we see Mitch is in the final scene of the play. Now, within this scene, Blanche is ultimately taken away to the mental institution. There is this ensuing struggle between her and the nurse, and then ultimately the doctor comes to take her away. Now, I've taken this extract from the Student Handbook to the Plays of Tennessee Williams, a great book that really offers an apt summary here of Mitch's actions within the final scene. When Mitch reappears in the final scene, he is evidently dogged by shame and an impotent fury. Now, impotence and inaction are words that really characterise Mitch within this play. He splutters with incoherent rage against Stanley, using the language of their card playing. You, brag, brag, bull, bull. When he hears Blanche's voice, his arm becomes nerveless, and his gaze is dissolved into space. He ducks his head as if to hide from her, and remains hunched over the table, sullen and ashamed when the others stand to let her pass. He cannot bear to look at her. Undignified and cowardly evasion is all that's left to him. And it is really quite a striking scene that as Blanche leaves, he's that dogged by shame and guilt that he can't even bear to look at her. Only when Blanche is fighting for survival against the grim nurse is he stung into movement, but he is blocked by Stanley, and his wild accusation merely ridiculed. So again, thinking about him being a weak, comic foil to Stanley, even when he tries to almost make a last stand and rescue Blanche, he's blocked by the more kind of vital, masculine and more forceful Stanley. You done all this. You're goddamn interfering with things, you. So he's mad here at Stanley. Notice how he's just described as being wild here. Quit the blubber. I'll kill you. He lunges and strikes at Stanley. And again, even this is just a source of ridicule. Hold this boneheaded crybaby. Mitch collapses, sobbing helplessly over the table. He, like Blanche, will have to find some way of trying to escape from the guilt and the sense of personal failure, or he will be finished. Perhaps he will translate the whole experience into a wistful memory to keep alongside his silver cigarette case from the strange, sweet dead girl with its significant inscription. And if God choose, I shall love thee better after death. Now remember, these lines from Sonnet 43 are what were engraved on his cigarette case and actually become a point of bonding between Mitch and Blanche within scene 3. So to summarise some of these key points about Mitch, initially at the start of this play, his gentleness and hesitancy come as a relief after Stanley's blustering towards Blanche. He shows a genuine concern for Stella's well-being and courtesy towards Blanche, which are both appealing and believable. And this, again, sets up this image of him being a foil to Stanley's characteristics and mannerisms. However, as the play goes on, we realise that this gentleness comes out of weakness rather than strength. His advances to Blanche are hesitant because he's doubtful of his power to please, and we get the impression that he's quite inexperienced with women, and more so that his capacity for affection and tenderness have long been absorbed by his devotion to his sick mother and the memories of this sweet dead girl from his past. And we see that, don't we, through his fixation and interest in that inscription on his cigarette case. As I've mentioned before, he appears quite childish to his friends. He's openly embarrassed about his bodily functions and the way he perspires, and he lacks the insight and intelligence to see through Blanche's willful self-dramatisation. He lacks the wisdom to see through Blanche's role-playing, that role being that of the virginal, chaste Southern belle, the pure Southern belle. And then actually, quite tragically, later in the play, he then lacks the wisdom and insight to see Blanche's true value and worth. Once his first illusions have been shattered by Stanley, he treats Blanche as an outsider, and he is unable to reconcile his sick mother with Blanche's promiscuous past, despite being quite okay with the fact that she's not 16 anymore. He can he can cope with her fading beauty. He can cope with the fact that she was once married, but he's unable to cope with her sordid and debased past. Now we have to question here whether Mitch irrationally, by the end of the play, wishes that Stanley could have let him remain in blissful ignorance, to be a fellow, or to be the audience of Blanche's play acting and role playing. I tend to think that Mitch probably would rather remain in blissful ignorance of Blanche's promiscuous past, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we see this outburst in scene 11. But whether or not this is the case, ultimately, by the end of the play, he cuts a pathetic figure. He's left sobbing on the table, and he's too morally weak either to confront Stanley effectively and with force, or to save Blanche. And really, this is the sort of overriding image of Mitch. He's filled with this sort of impotent fury, as it says by the end of the play. Now, his own impotence, weakness and insipid nature, ironically, kind of is there primarily to heighten the vividness and strength of both Stanley and Blanche. His own weakness serves to contrast the two energetic forces within the play, which are obviously Blanche and Stanley. And you could also say that, in a similar fashion to Stella, Mitch's weakness and passivity is there to sort of heighten the characteristics of those around him. And ultimately, like Blanche, Mitch struggles to deal with the harsh reality of life, this literalism and realism that he's confronted with, and wishes to remain in a world of illusion. Perhaps this is the case. Perhaps this is something that they both share. That's something for you to think about. Perhaps Blanche and Mitch are kind of similar in that way, that they're unable to deal with the harsh reality of life and would rather remain in this world of magic and not realism. Now, Tennessee Williams famously said that one key theme in all of his work is the destructive impact of society on the non-conformist individual. Now, perhaps Mitch, in a similar way to Blanche and in a similar way to Alan Gray, is another example of a non-conformist individual who is eventually destroyed by the society in which they are placed. I hope you found this useful, and good luck in the rest of your studying. Thank you.